The patio door slid open quietly, letting in a breath of cool evening air as I settled into the wicker chair, holding a glass of wine that I didn't feel like drinking. It was one of those tranquil nights when the silence of our backyard was broken only by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. I sat there alone, eyes drifting over the darkened garden, absorbed in thought. My husband, Alan, was away on one of his work trips, and although I was used to his absences, something about tonight felt different, a strange unease that I couldn't quite shake. My solitude didn't last long. The sound of footsteps, barely audible against the gravel path, pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Julian, Alan's cousin, approaching. He was staying with us for a few days, a temporary arrangement while he sorted out a new job and apartment in the city. Julian was tall, with an easy confidence that had always set him apart. A few years younger than Alan, he had a certain charm that was both familiar and unfamiliar, someone who felt close yet distant enough to intrigue me. "Mind if I join?" he asked, his voice soft as he gestured to the empty chair across from me. I offered a small smile. "Not at all. It's a quiet evening." He settled into the chair, his gaze drifting over the garden before landing on me. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, giving me a look that felt a little too intense, as though he could see beyond my polite smile. "Not at all," I repeated, though the words felt unsteady. There was an undeniable warmth in his presence, a comfortable weight to the silence that fell between us. I wondered if he could sense the slight tension in my voice, the tiny hesitation I was trying to suppress. Julian stretched his arms behind his head and leaned back, letting out a deep sigh. "It's been a while since I've been anywhere this quiet. City life doesn't offer much of a break, you know?" "True," I replied, watching him with a faint smile. "Alan and I moved here for that exact reason. He's always been fond of the quiet." Julian looked at me thoughtfully, as if there was something on his mind. "How is Alan, by the way? I mean, really?" I was taken aback by his directness. Most people didn't ask me these kinds of questions. "He's fine, I suppose. You know him. Always busy." He nodded, his eyes studying my face. "You seem like you have a lot on your mind, too," he said gently. I hesitated, caught off guard by how easily he could read me. "Maybe," I admitted, taking a slow sip of my wine. "Life gets complicated, doesn't it?" Julian let out a soft laugh, a low sound that seemed to vibrate in the quiet air. "It does," he agreed, his gaze lingering on me a bit too long, just enough for me to notice. The conversation drifted from one topic to another, our words filling the cool night air with an ease that surprised me. There was something almost intoxicating about the way he spoke, a quiet confidence that drew me in. Julian wasn't like most people. He was attentive, genuinely interested, and had a way of listening that made me feel truly seen. And then there was the way he looked at me, a subtle, almost imperceptible intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't inappropriate, not exactly, but it felt close, like a warmth just beneath the surface. As the night wore on, the distance between us seemed to shrink, our conversation becoming softer, more intimate. I found myself laughing at his jokes, feeling a strange flutter in my stomach that I hadn't felt in years. Julian's smile was infectious, his laughter rich and genuine. I felt a twinge of guilt each time my gaze lingered a bit too long on the curve of his mouth or the spark in his eyes, but I couldn't help it. There was an unspoken connection between us, one that neither of us acknowledged, but both seemed to feel. "Do you ever feel like life just passes by?" he asked suddenly, breaking a long stretch of silence. I blinked, his question hitting closer to home than he probably realized. "Sometimes," I said softly. "Sometimes, it feels like I'm watching it happen from a distance, like I'm on the outside looking in." Julian nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I get that," he murmured. "Sometimes, I think we all get so caught up in what we think we should be doing that we forget to actually live." A lump formed in my throat as his words settled over me. I wanted to look away, to break the spell he seemed to be casting over me, but I couldn't. There was a depth to his gaze, an understanding that made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. "I think you're right," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "It's easy to get lost." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he reached across the small table, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. The touch was subtle, almost accidental, but it was enough to make my heart race. I pulled my hand back, embarrassed by my reaction, but he didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't show it. "I should probably head inside," I said quickly, standing up and clutching my glass a little too tightly. "It's getting late." Julian rose with me, his expression unreadable as he watched me. "Of course. Thank you for the company," he said softly, his voice lingering in the air like a faint melody. I nodded, unable to find the words to reply, and slipped back inside, closing the patio door behind me. But even as I left him out there, his presence lingered, a warmth that seemed to settle deep in my chest, refusing to let go. I went to bed that night with thoughts of Julian haunting my mind, the memory of his gaze and the softness of his voice replaying over and over in my head. It was wrong, I knew that. He was Alan's cousin, and this was nothing more than a harmless conversation on the patio. But as I lay there in the quiet darkness, I couldn't help but wonder if he'd felt it too, the strange connection, the spark that had flared up between us. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a brief moment of weakness in the absence of my husband. But even as I told myself that, a part of me couldn't help but hope that Julian had felt it too, that he, too, was lying awake, thinking about the night we'd shared on the patio. The next morning, I busied myself with chores, hoping to shake the lingering thoughts of Julian. But the harder I tried to forget, the more those memories of our quiet, intimate conversation on the patio seemed to surface, filling my mind with questions I had no answers for. Julian was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, dressed casually, leaning against the counter as he poured himself a cup of coffee. He looked up as I entered, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral as I headed to the fridge. I could feel his gaze on me, that same quiet intensity from the night before, and it made me feel more vulnerable than I wanted to admit. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yes," I lied, managing a smile. "How about you?" His eyes held mine for a moment before he answered. "Better than usual." There was something about the way he said it, a subtle inflection in his voice that made me wonder if he'd also been up late, thinking about the night we'd shared. I felt a pang of guilt, but there was a strange thrill beneath it, a dangerous excitement that simmered just beneath the surface. Our morning passed in a strange dance of polite exchanges and lingering glances, both of us aware of the unspoken tension that filled the air between us. Each accidental brush of our hands, each shared smile felt like a spark, igniting something we both knew was dangerous, but couldn't seem to resist. As the days went by, our interactions grew more intimate, each moment together filled with a silent intensity that left me breathless. There were stolen glances across the dinner table, quiet conversations that seemed to stretch on forever, and fleeting touches that sent shivers down my spine. Julian was careful, respectful, but I could feel the weight of his desire in every word, every look. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I felt his presence behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I turned, my breath catching as I looked up at him. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of longing and restraint. "Do you need any help?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. He didn't move, and neither did I. We stood there, frozen in place, caught in a moment that felt like it could go in any direction. His hand lifted slightly, hovering between us before he seemed to think better of it and dropped it back to his side. "I should probably let you finish up," he murmured, taking a step back, though his gaze never left mine. But I didn't want him to go. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing against his arm. The touch was light, barely a graze, but it was enough to make his eyes darken, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Stay," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for a long, agonizing moment. And then, as if some invisible barrier between us had crumbled, He took a step closer, his hand lifting to cup my cheek. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as though he were afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into his hand, closing my eyes as a shiver ran through me. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just let his thumb brush softly over my skin, tracing a line down to my jaw. It was a simple touch, but it felt intimate in a way I couldn't quite explain, as though he were trying to tell me something with his touch alone. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me with a look of such tenderness that it made my heart ache. "This, whatever this is," he murmured, his voice unsteady. "It's complicated." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I know." For a long moment, we just stood there, caught in a strange limbo between desire and restraint. And then, with a soft sigh, he leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine. "We shouldn't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I can't seem to stay away." Neither could I. My hand found his, our fingers intertwining as we stood there, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same, that I, too, was struggling with this forbidden attraction. But the words wouldn't come, so I simply squeezed his hand, hoping he understood. His other hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb tracing soft circles over my skin. The touch sent a wave of warmth through me, a gentle reminder of the connection we'd been dancing around since that night on the patio. I tilted my head, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, it felt as though everything else had fallen away, leaving just the two of us in a world of our own. And then, slowly, carefully, he leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine. The kiss was tentative, a question more than an answer, as though he were testing the waters, afraid of pushing too far. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the softness of his mouth, the warmth of his hand on my neck, the gentle pressure of his lips against mine. For a few heartbeats, everything else ceased to exist. There was no guilt, no fear, only the quiet intimacy of the moment, the soft sound of our breaths mingling as we lost ourselves in each other. His hand tightened in mine, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a silent promise, a reassurance that he was here, that he wasn't going anywhere. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, I met his gaze, searching for any sign of regret. But there was none. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with an emotion I didn't dare name but recognized all the same. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my skin. "I don't know where this will lead," he murmured, his voice soft but steady. "But I know I don't want it to end." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Neither do I." He smiled then, a small, hesitant smile that seemed to hold a world of unspoken promises. And as he pulled me back into his arms, I knew that whatever happened next, we were in this together, for better or worse. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but feel the electricity that crackled between Julian and me. Each glance, every accidental touch, sent ripples through my chest. It was like we were sharing a secret only we understood, a connection that was both thrilling and terrifying. Alan's calls became harder to answer. The sound of his voice reminded me of the line I'd crossed, the line that Julian and I continued to blur each day. One afternoon, I was out on the patio again, the same place where this all began. The sun was setting, casting warm, golden light across the garden, and I sat, lost in thought. I barely heard Julian's footsteps as he approached, though a part of me sensed his presence even before he spoke. "Mind if I join you again?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I looked up at him, my heart quickening at the sight of his familiar smile. "Of course not," I murmured, motioning to the chair beside me. He settled in next to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. There was a comfortable silence between us, a shared understanding that needed no words. But this time, the quiet didn't last long. "Can I ask you something?" Julian's voice broke through the stillness, his tone tentative. "Anything," I replied, my curiosity piqued by the seriousness in his gaze. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "Do you ever think about what your life might have been like if you'd made different choices?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a pang in my chest as I considered it. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. But it's hard to look back. There's always a price to pay for the life you choose, isn't there? Julian nodded, his gaze intense as he watched me. Yeah, there is. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made me want to reach out, to comfort him. I took a deep breath, my hand lifting instinctively to touch his arm, a gesture meant to reassure. But the moment our skin made contact, the air between us shifted, thickening with a tension that had been building since that first night. His gaze flickered down to where my hand rested against his arm, his eyes darkening. I knew I should pull away, knew that every second our touch lingered only complicated things further. But I couldn't bring myself to break the connection. Instead, I let my fingers slide down his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. I think about it a lot lately, he murmured, his voice barely audible. About choices, about paths not taken. I swallowed, my heart pounding in my chest. You're not alone in that. For a long moment, neither of us moved. And then, as though drawn by some invisible force, Julian leaned closer, his eyes never leaving mine. There was a question in his gaze, a silent request for permission, and in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Without thinking, I leaned in, my heart racing as our faces drew closer. When his lips finally met mine, it was like everything else faded away, the guilt, the fear, the uncertainty. All that mattered was the warmth of his mouth against mine, the gentle pressure of his kiss as he held me close. The kiss was soft, tentative, like we were both testing the waters, afraid of diving too deep. But the longer we kissed, the more the tension between us built, a slow-burning flame that threatened to consume us both. I felt his hand slide to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair as he deepened the kiss, pulling me closer. Every nerve in my body seemed to come alive, responding to his touch in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I knew this was dangerous, knew that we were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, but in that moment, I didn't care. All I wanted was him. The warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. When we finally pulled away, both of us were breathless, our faces flushed. Julian's hand lingered against my cheek, his thumb brushing softly over my skin as he looked at me, his gaze filled with an intensity that took my breath away. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though there was no regret in his eyes. "I shouldn't have." "Don't be," I interrupted, my voice soft but steady. "I wanted this too." He let out a soft sigh, his forehead resting against mine. "This is complicated." I laughed quietly, the sound filled with a bittersweet edge. That's an understatement. We sat there in silence, our breaths mingling as we tried to process what had just happened. And then, without another word, Julian pulled me into his arms, holding me close. I leaned into his embrace, letting myself savor the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my cheek. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. It was a feeling I'd nearly forgotten, a spark that I thought had long since faded. But Julian had reignited something inside me, something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in shades of dusky pink and gold, we sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, both of us knowing that whatever this was, it was more than just a fleeting moment. It was real, tangible, a connection that neither of us could ignore. The days that followed were filled with stolen moments and secret glances, each one adding fuel to the fire that burned between us. We were careful, always mindful of the line we'd crossed, but the intensity of our connection was undeniable. Every touch, every look, felt charged with an energy that neither of us could resist. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Julian reached across the counter, his hand brushing against mine in a way that felt anything but accidental. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw the same hunger in his eyes that I felt in my own. Before I knew it, he was pulling me into his arms, his mouth capturing mine in a kiss that was anything but gentle. This kiss was fierce, demanding, filled with a passion that left me breathless. My hands tangled in his hair as I kissed him back, pouring all of the longing and desire I'd kept bottled up for so long into that one kiss. We broke apart only when we were both breathless, our faces flushed, our hearts racing. Julian's hand lingered against my cheek, his eyes searching mine as he tried to catch his breath. This is dangerous," he murmured, his voice a mixture of desire and caution. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I can't stop." Neither could he. His mouth found mine again, softer this time, his kiss filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. We stood there in the kitchen, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside forgotten as we lost ourselves in each other. As our days blurred into each other, the tension between us grew like a fire we couldn't control, spreading to every corner of our lives. Julian's presence became both my escape and my torment. Each stolen moment felt like an indulgence I couldn't resist, even though I knew that every touch, every glance, only pulled us deeper into something that we couldn't easily escape. One evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Julian had disappeared into the den to finish up some work, leaving me to my thoughts. The quiet of the house felt heavy, each creak and whisper of the wind outside amplifying the strange ache inside me. I had just turned off the kitchen light when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I shook my head, feeling a familiar warmth spread through me at the sound of his voice.
"No."
"Just thinking?" He nodded, stepping closer. There was an intensity in his gaze, a quiet desperation that mirrored my own. He didn't say anything as he approached, but his eyes held mine, conveying a depth of emotion that words couldn't capture. When he finally reached me, he stopped just inches away, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from my face. The touch was soft, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver through me. "Julian," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. "I know this is wrong," he murmured, his hand still resting against my cheek. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Neither could I. Every logical part of my mind screamed that this was dangerous, that I was on the brink of a decision that could unravel everything I'd worked so hard to build. But as I looked into his eyes, seeing the same longing, the same conflict, all those rational thoughts slipped away. I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin, the softness of his touch, and I knew, with a clarity I couldn't deny, that there was no turning back. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand sliding to the back of his neck as I pulled him closer. Our lips met in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a mixture of desperation and relief. It was as though we'd both been holding back, restrained by the walls we'd built around ourselves, and now those walls had crumbled, leaving us exposed and vulnerable. The kiss deepened, becoming more intense, more urgent. His hands slid down my arms, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My heart raced as his mouth moved over mine, his touch igniting a fire that I hadn't felt in years. I wrapped my arms around him, letting myself get lost in the warmth of his embrace, the strength of his hold. The world around us faded, leaving only the two of us in the quiet darkness. Our breaths mingled in the small space between kisses, our hands exploring, memorizing, cherishing. Julian's touch was both gentle and possessive, as though he wanted to claim every part of me, to leave a mark that no one else could erase. I felt the same need, the same desire to hold on to him, to make this moment last forever. He broke away, just enough to look into my eyes, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and vulnerability. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice rough, laced with an emotion that took my breath away. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the intensity of what I was feeling. Instead, I pulled him back to me, my lips finding his in a kiss that held all the answers he needed. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close as we moved together, our bodies fitting perfectly, as though we were two pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their match. The hours that followed felt like a dream, a blur of whispered words, gentle caresses, and stolen breaths. We moved together in perfect harmony, each touch, each kiss a silent promise of something that went beyond words. It was as though we'd found a hidden language, one that only the two of us understood, a language built on desire and tenderness, on a connection that neither of us could explain. As dawn began to break, casting soft light across the room, we lay together, our bodies tangled, our breaths slowing. Julian's fingers traced gentle patterns on my skin, his touch soothing, grounding me in the reality of what we'd just shared. I looked up at him, my heart full, and saw the same emotions mirrored in his eyes. For a while, we lay there in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. But the reality of what we'd done began to creep back in, casting a shadow over the warmth that had filled the room only moments before. Julian's hand tightened around mine, his gaze troubled. "What happens now?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I knew that we couldn't stay in this moment forever, that eventually we'd have to face the consequences of our actions. But as I looked into his eyes, seeing the same fear, the same uncertainty, I realized that I wasn't alone in this. Whatever happened, whatever came next, we would face it together. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I know that I don't regret this." Julian's eyes softened, his hand lifting to cup my cheek. "Neither do I." We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the last moments of peace before reality came crashing back in. And as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the room, casting a warm glow over us, I felt a strange sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this together. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act, a constant struggle between our desire to be together and the reality of the lives we'd built apart. Each day brought new challenges, new moments of doubt, but we faced them together, our connection growing stronger with every shared glance, every whispered conversation. But there were moments when the weight of what we'd done threatened to pull us under, moments when the guilt became too much to bear. Julian and I would sit together in silence, our hands entwined, both of us knowing that this couldn't last forever, that eventually we'd have to make a choice. Yet, despite the uncertainty, despite the fear, there was a part of me that couldn't imagine letting him go. Julian had become a part of me, a piece of my heart that I wasn't willing to lose. And as the weeks passed, as our bond deepened, I began to realize that no matter what happened, no matter what the future held, I would always carry this piece of him with me. And maybe in the end, that was enough. Each passing day felt like a small miracle, a precious moment borrowed from a life that wasn't really ours. Julian and I continued to find comfort in each other's presence, seeking out quiet moments where we could exist together, if only for a short while. Every look, every touch, every stolen kiss carried the weight of all that we couldn't say out loud. But as much as we tried to keep our secret safe, it felt as though the walls around us were closing in, the reality of our choices looming larger with each passing day. One evening, I found myself sitting by the window, watching the rain trickle down the glass. Alan had called earlier, letting me know he'd be home that weekend. Normally, his return would have been a relief, a welcome end to the silence of the house. But now, it felt like a storm brewing on the horizon, a reminder that the delicate world Julian and I had built would soon be shattered. Julian came into the room, his footsteps soft as he approached. He took one look at me, his expression shifting to one of concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. I looked up at him, trying to mask the turmoil churning inside me. "Alan's coming home," I whispered, the words heavy in the quiet room. He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he processed what that meant. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with unspoken fears. "What are we going to do?" he finally asked, his voice filled with a mixture of dread and resignation. I shook my head, unable to find an answer. "I don't know." Julian reached out, his fingers brushing against mine in a gesture that was both comforting and heartbreaking. "I don't want this to end," he murmured, his gaze filled with a desperation that mirrored my own. "Neither do I," replied, my voice barely audible. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. Alan's return meant that our time together was running out, that the world we'd created would soon be forced to make way for the life I'd built with someone else. The days leading up to Alan's return passed in a blur, each moment with Julian feeling both precious and painful. We spent our time together wrapped in a bittersweet silence, savoring the last moments we had before everything changed. And with each passing day, the weight of our choices grew heavier, pressing down on us until it felt like we could hardly breathe. Finally, the day arrived. I watched from the window as Alan's car pulled into the driveway, my heart pounding as I braced myself for the inevitable. Julian stood behind me, his presence a quiet comfort even as the reality of what we were about to face loomed large. Alan stepped out of the car, a familiar smile on his face, as he waved up at me. I forced myself to wave back, my hand trembling as I tried to mask the guilt that threatened to overwhelm me. Julian's hand found mine, squeezing it briefly before he let go, stepping back to allow me to face this moment on my own. As I walked to the door, my heart heavy with the weight of what we'd done, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. I knew that whatever happened next, there was no escaping the consequences of our actions. But I also knew that I couldn't go back, couldn't pretend that what Julian and I had shared was anything less than real. Alan's embrace was warm, familiar, a reminder of the life we'd built together. But as I held him, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had crept into my heart, the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted within me. The following days were filled with a strange tension, a sense of distance that I couldn't quite bridge. Julian and I were careful, maintaining a polite distance whenever Alan was around, but the connection between us was impossible to hide completely. Every glance, every fleeting touch felt like a silent confession, a reminder of all that we couldn't say out loud. One evening, as Alan was preparing dinner, Julian and I found ourselves alone in the hallway. It was a brief, stolen moment, but it was enough. He reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine in a gesture that was both comforting and painful. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet desperation that tore at my heart. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Neither can I." He looked at me, his eyes filled with an intensity that took my breath away. "Then maybe it's time we made a choice." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air between us, a question that neither of us was ready to answer. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew that he was right. We couldn't go on like this, couldn't keep pretending that we could have both a life with Alan and a future together. That night, as I lay in bed beside Alan, I felt the full weight of our situation settle over me. I knew that the time had come to make a choice, that I could no longer keep running from the reality of what we'd done. But as I lay there, torn between two worlds, I realized that no matter what choice I made, someone would be hurt. In the end, the choice was both simple and impossible. I knew that I couldn't betray Alan any longer, couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. But I also knew that letting Julian go would mean losing a part of myself, a part that I wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, I made my way to the patio, where Julian was waiting. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable as he took in the look on my face. "We can't keep doing this," I said softly, the words breaking the silence between us. He nodded, his gaze filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "I know." For a long moment, we just stood there, neither of us willing to say the words that would bring this chapter of our lives to an end. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, we stepped into each other's arms, our embrace filled with all the things we couldn't say. When we finally pulled away, there were tears in his eyes, a silent testament to the pain we both felt. He reached up, his fingers brushing softly against my cheek, a gentle goodbye. "I'll never forget you," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet conviction that took my breath away. "Neither will I replied, my voice breaking as I looked into his eyes one last time. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing on the patio, my heart heavy with the weight of all we'd shared. As I watched him disappear down the path, I knew that my life would never be the same, that I would carry this piece of him with me always. And though the pain of our goodbye was nearly unbearable, there was a part of me that felt strangely at peace, knowing that what we'd shared was real, that it had been worth the heartache. In the end, our love had been both a gift and a curse, a reminder of all the beauty and pain that life could hold. And as I stood there, watching the sun rise over the garden, I knew that I would carry this memory with me, a bittersweet reminder of the love I'd found and lost.